The waiting room was small and very bright. That is the first thing I remember about it, the brightness. The kind of light that exists nowhere in an Amish home, nowhere in a barn or a kitchen or a church house, the kind of light that does not flatter anything and hides nothing. I sat in a plastic chair with my hands folded in my lap the way I had been taught to sit since I was small, back straight, feet together, eyes down. There was a table beside me with a small stack of pamphlets fanned out like playing cards. I do not know why I reached for one. I think my hands needed something to do while the rest of me tried not to fall apart. The pamphlet had a diagram on the front, a drawing of a woman's body, cross-sectioned, labeled, every part named in clean black print. I looked at it for a long time. I had been married for 3 years at that point. I had carried 2 pregnancies inside the body in that diagram. I had been living inside that body for 24 years. And I was looking at it the way you look at a map of a country you have lived in your whole life but were never allowed to study. Recognizing the shape of things without understanding the names, feeling the strange vertigo of arriving somewhere you should have known a long time ago. I did not feel embarrassed. I want to be clear about that. What I felt was older than embarrassment and much harder to name. It sat somewhere behind my sternum and it did not move for a long time. My name is Clara and this is Amish Clara, the channel where I tell the stories I was raised to keep quiet. I grew up Old Order Amish in a small district in Pennsylvania. I was married at 19 and I left at 26, and the leaving is its own story for another day. But this story, this one, starts much earlier than the leaving. It starts at 12 years old, alone in a house believing I was dying. And it does not end until I am sitting in a clinic parking lot at 24, saying a word out loud that I had never heard before, learning for the first time that my body had a name for what it had been doing to me for years. If you are watching this and you have ever felt that you arrived late to your own body, that there were things happening inside you that no one ever gave you the language to describe, please stay. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing the stories from behind the prayer cap. And in the comments, tell me this. Did anyone ever sit you down and explain your own body to you? Because no one ever sat me down. And for a long time, I thought that was simply how it was. I thought the silence was normal. I did not yet understand that the silence had been built. In the community where I grew up, the body was not a subject. It was not discussed, not named, not explained. There were no diagrams on any wall I ever studied beside. There were no conversations between mothers and daughters that used the correct words for anything. The body was something that existed below the level of language in our home, something that happened to you, something you managed quietly, something you did not bring into the kitchen and set on the table and ask questions about. When I was 9 years old, I woke up one morning with a cramp low in my stomach that made me fold in half. I found my mother in the kitchen, and I told her my stomach hurt in a way it had never hurt before. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Go lie down," and turned back to the stove. That was the whole conversation. I lay on my bed for most of that day, staring at the ceiling, running my hands over my stomach, trying to understand what was happening inside me. Nobody came to explain it. By evening, the pain had eased and I got up and helped set the table for supper and never mentioned it again. That was how I learned the first rule. Not with words, but with silence. The rule was this: your body is not something you are allowed to ask about. The question itself is the problem. Whatever is happening inside you, you manage it alone and you do not bring it into the light. I was 12 the first time I bled. I want to tell you that sentence plainly because for most of my life I would not have been able to say it plainly. I would have circled it. I would have softened it. I would have found some way to name it that didn't require me to use the actual word, because I did not have the actual word, because no one had ever given it to me. I woke up very early on a Tuesday in October. The room was dark and cold and something was wrong. I did not understand what was wrong. I understood only that there was blood and that I was alone in the house because my parents had left before dawn for a neighbor's farm, and my older sister had gone with them, and I was the only one home except for the 2 youngest children who were still asleep. I will not describe to you in full what those 3 hours were like because some things are too private even now, but I will tell you this. I believed I was dying. Not as a dramatic thought, not as a child's exaggeration, but as a genuine, quiet, settling conviction. I believed something had broken inside me, and that I was losing something I could not get back. I sat on the edge of my bed in the cold, and I prayed the only prayer I knew how to pray, which was, "Please God, please God, please God," and I waited for something to either get better or get much worse. I hid it for 3 days. I tore strips from an old apron I found at the back of a drawer, and I washed them secretly at night in the cold water of the hand pump outside, and I hung them behind the woodpile to dry before anyone came looking. On the third day, my mother found them. She stood in the kitchen holding the strips of fabric, and she looked at me and she said 4 words. Just 4 words. I will tell you what those 4 words were, but I need you to understand something first. I need you to understand what those 4 words built in me, and what they cost me, and what they kept me from knowing for the next 12 years of my life. Because the words themselves were small. It was the architecture around them that did the damage. I was 19 when my parents told me I would be married. I had known Jonas for most of my life the way you know everyone in a small district. From across the room at church, from the edge of conversations, from the particular shape of a family's farm seen from the road. He was 22. He had his father's chin and his mother's silences, and everyone agreed he would make a steady husband. The preparation I received for marriage could be contained inside one sentence spoken to me by my mother the evening before the wedding. She found me in the kitchen after the other women had gone home, and she stood beside me at the window, and she said one thing. One sentence. Then she squeezed my hand and left the room. I stood at that window for a long time after she left. I was trying to build a map out of a single sentence. I was trying to understand what was about to happen to me using only what I had been given, which was almost nothing. I had fragments, overheard words, things said between older women that stopped when a younger woman entered the room. A general understanding, outlined in shadow, that marriage involved something I did not have clear words for, and that whatever it was my duty, and my silence around it was also my duty. I entered my marriage the way I had entered everything in my life, with my back straight and my eyes down and a terrible, quiet, working ignorance that I had been taught to call faith. The first year was what I now understand was a year of learning to disappear inside my own body, of learning to be present in it without being in it, of learning the particular skill that I would later find out many women in my community had mastered, the skill of being somewhere else entirely while remaining perfectly still. By the time I was 22, I had been in pain for months. Not the ordinary tiredness of a woman who works a farm and raises children and keeps a house. Something different. Something that lived low in my body and came in waves and sometimes bent me double over the kitchen counter while I gripped the edge of the wood and breathed slowly and waited for it to pass. Something that made the days I was supposed to be in bed feel like punishment I had earned without understanding what I had done. I asked my husband. He told me to pray harder. I believed him because I had been given no reason not to. Because in the world I lived in, the body's mysterious suffering was almost always interpreted as spiritual information. Pain without visible cause was not a medical question. It was a question for God, and the answer God gave you was endurance. I asked my mother-in-law. She brought me a tea she said her mother had given her, and she patted my hand, and she said some women feel things more strongly than others, and the feeling passes if you don't feed it too much attention. I drank the tea. The pain did not pass. I stopped mentioning it because the only thing worse than the pain was the particular way the women in my community looked at me when I mentioned it. Not unkindly, but with a settled certainty that the problem was somewhere inside my faith and not somewhere inside my body. I began performing wellness. This is the only honest way I know to describe what I did. I smiled at church. I stood straight at barn raisings. I answered, "Good, thank you," to every woman who asked how I was doing with a steadiness in my voice that I practiced the way I practiced hymns, quietly, repeatedly, alone. And inside, in the part of me that the community could not see, something was very wrong and getting slowly, steadily worse. There was an older woman in our district named Miriam. She was in her late 60s, small and quick-eyed, with the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by anything a long time ago. I did not know her well. We were not close in the way women in small communities sometimes become close. But she watched things. You could feel her watching things. One afternoon at a quilting, she sat down beside me at the frame, and for a few minutes we worked in silence. Then she leaned slightly toward me and she started to say something. I could feel it, the intake of breath before something real, the slight shift in her body toward mine that meant what was coming was not small talk. She said, "Clara, I want to tell you something about..." And then a younger woman came through the door and set a tray down on the table, and the room shifted, and Miriam stopped. She sat back. She picked up her needle. She did not look at me again for the rest of the afternoon. But before she moved away, she pressed her hand over mine on the quilt frame for just a moment, and she said quietly, without looking at me, "You are not the first, child." Then she stood and moved to the other side of the frame, and that was the end of it. I thought about those words for weeks. You are not the first. The first what? The first to hurt this way. The first to be told to pray. The first to smile at church with something bent and nameless living inside her body. I did not know what Miriam had almost told me. I would not find out for 2 more years. But I carried those words with me the way you carry something fragile. Carefully, in both hands, not quite understanding what it is, but knowing that it matters. I want to tell you about the theology of the female body as I was taught it. Not from a textbook, not from a pulpit, but from the kitchen and the quilting frame and the long silences between women who knew things they were not passing on. The messages were never stated plainly. They did not need to be. They were structural. They were in the absence of explanation. They were in the look my mother gave me at 9 when I said my stomach hurt. They were in the single sentence the night before my wedding. They were in the way older women said, "Some women feel things more strongly," and then changed the subject. The theology went something like this: a woman's body is not hers to understand. It is hers to use in service of her husband and her children and her community. Its workings are private matters between her and God. Pain during certain things is normal and expected, and complaining about it is a weakness of faith. A woman who pays too much attention to her own body is a woman who is not paying enough attention to her duties. I absorbed this theology the way I absorbed everything in my childhood, not by being told, but by living inside it until it became the shape of my thinking. Until I could not see it as theology at all. Until it was simply the way things were. What I did not know then, what I would not understand until much later, was that this theology was not accidental. It was not simply the result of modesty or tradition or old-fashioned values. It was functional. A woman who does not know her own body cannot advocate for it. A woman who cannot name her pain cannot demand that it be addressed. A woman who has been taught that her suffering is a spiritual question and not a medical one will keep that suffering inside the system that produced it and will manage it quietly and will not go looking for answers outside the walls that have been built so carefully around her. The silence was not modesty. The silence was infrastructure. I lost a pregnancy when I was 23. It happened quickly, in the night, in my bedroom, with only the midwife who came from 2 farms over and my mother-in-law who sat in the corner with her hands folded and did not speak. There was no doctor. There was no hospital. There was no discussion of what had happened or why or what it meant for my body going forward. The midwife said these things happen, and it is God's will and you will rest for a week. My mother-in-law made soup. My husband told me he was sorry and went back to work the next morning. I lay in my bedroom for 7 days. I looked at the ceiling. I looked at the window. I looked at the particular slant of October light that came through the glass in the late afternoon and moved slowly across the floor and disappeared. And I thought, I do not have a word for what just happened to me. I have lost something. I have been through something. My body has done something enormous, and I do not have a single word that belongs to me to put around it. Not a medical word, not a correct word. Only the soft, evasive language of God's will, and these things happen, and you will rest, and then you will get up and continue. I got up. I continued. I put the unnamed thing in the same place I had been putting unnamed things my entire life, somewhere below language, below asking, below the line where questions were permitted. But something had shifted. Something small and quiet had shifted. And a few months later, when the pain in my lower body became something my husband could no longer ignore because it was affecting my ability to work the farm, he agreed, reluctantly, with conditions, with a conversation between himself and his father that I was not part of, that I could see an outside doctor. The drive to the clinic was the longest I had taken in years. My husband drove and did not speak, and I sat beside him and looked at the road and thought about what I would say. I had been rehearsing in my head for days. I tried to find words for what was wrong with me. I kept running up against the same wall. I did not have the vocabulary. I knew something was wrong. I could describe the location of the pain approximately. I could describe when it was worse. But I had no framework for it. No way to place it inside a larger understanding of how my body worked or what its parts were called or what was normal and what was not. The waiting room was small and very bright. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, and I reached for a pamphlet from the table beside me without quite meaning to. The diagram on the front stopped me. A woman's body, labeled, named, every part given its correct word. I looked at it for a long time. The doctor who saw me was a woman. She was calm and unhurried, and she asked me questions in a voice that did not make me feel stupid, though she must have noticed immediately, that I could not answer the most basic ones. She asked me to describe my cycle. I looked at her. She asked when my symptoms typically occurred. I looked at her. She asked if I had ever been examined for any gynecological condition. I did not know what that word meant, not all of it. And I sat on the edge of the table in my plain dress with my hands in my lap, and I felt the full weight of 24 years of structured silence sitting on top of me. The doctor asked me one question that I could not answer, not because I was hiding something, not because I was embarrassed, because I had never once in my life been given permission to know the answer. Because the answer lived in a part of my own body that I had not been allowed to study, to name, to understand, to claim. She was very gentle with me. She took her time. She told me I had endometriosis. She explained what it was. She used words I had never heard. She drew a small diagram on a piece of paper, and she named the parts of my body that were involved with a precision and a matter-of-factness that made me feel two things at once: an enormous relief and an enormous grief. Relief, because there was a name. Because the pain had a cause. Because I was not weak in faith, I was not feeding it too much attention, I was not failing some spiritual test. There was a condition, and it had a name, and it had a treatment. The pain was real. The pain had always been real. And grief because of how long the pain had been real without a name. Because I was 24 years old. Because this had been happening to me since I was 12, possibly earlier, building slowly inside a body I had never been given permission to understand. Because every year of silence had been a year of worsening. Because the woman who said some women feel things more strongly had known, I think, that this was possible, and had given me tea instead of a doctor's name. I sat in the parking lot of the clinic for a long time after my husband had started the truck and told me we needed to get back. I held the pamphlet the doctor had given me in both hands. I said the word out loud to myself, quietly, the way you sound out a word in a new language. Endometriosis. Endometriosis. I said it twice. I said it a third time. I was 24 years old, and I was meeting my own body for the first time. I was being handed a map that should have been given to me 12 years earlier, when I sat on the edge of my bed in the cold and prayed, please God, please God, please God, and believed with my whole heart that I was dying. I went home with a prescription and a pamphlet and a word. I told my husband only what I had to tell him, that the doctor had found something, that there was medicine, that it would help. I did not show him the pamphlet. I slid it between the pages of my Bible that night, which is perhaps the most Amish thing I have ever done, hiding new knowledge inside the oldest book in the house. I began reading in secret, not just about endometriosis, about the body, about how it worked, what it was called, what was normal and what was not, what I should have learned at 12 and at 15 and at 19 before my wedding night, and at 22 when the pain began, and at 23 when I lay in my bedroom for 7 days, looking at the light move across the floor. Every page was a grief. Not an angry grief at first, that came later. At first it was the quieter grief, the longer one, the grief of arriving somewhere late and realizing what the lateness had cost. I mourned the girl who hid her rags behind the woodpile. I mourned the 19-year-old who stood at a window the night before her wedding, trying to build a map from a single sentence. I mourned every morning I had gripped the kitchen counter and breathed through something I had no name for. Every time I had said good thank you, every year I had spent performing wellness while something real and nameable was happening inside me, without my knowledge or consent. I went to my mother with one question. I did not go angry. I did not go with an accusation. I went with the particular exhaustion of a woman who has recently been given a large piece of information and is trying to understand where it fits inside everything she thought she knew. I asked her, Mama, when I was 12 and I came to you that morning and told you my stomach hurt, did you know what was happening to me? She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said the 4 words she had said to me 31 years earlier, the 4 words I had been carrying since I was 9 years old, the 4 words I had promised you in the beginning of this story. She said, this is women's work. That was it. That was the whole answer. Not then and not now. This is women's work, meaning this is something women manage. This is something women carry. This is not something we explain because explanation is not what we do with this. We endure it. We manage it quietly. We hand it forward unnamed because that is what was handed to us. She said those words to me at the kitchen table, and she looked at her hands, and I understood, finally, fully, in the way you understand something when you have been given the right language to hold it, that she had known. Not everything. She didn't know the word endometriosis. She may not have known the full scope of what was wrong with me, but she had known that something was happening to me that morning at 12, that it was the beginning of something, and she had made a choice. The same choice her mother had made before her, not cruelty, architecture. She had handed me the silence the way it had been handed to her, as the correct and only response. After I left the community, my therapist gave me words for what I had lived inside. She gave them slowly, one at a time, the way you hand things to someone whose arms are already full. Medical neglect sustained by religious authority. She said it carefully, watching my face. Bodily autonomy framed as spiritual threat. The use of shame as structural control, not individual cruelty, not any one person's intention, but a system that required women not to know themselves because a woman who knows her own body is a woman who knows when something is being done to it without her permission. I thought about my mother. I thought about my mother-in-law with her tea and her settled certainty. I thought about the bishop's wife who had come to other women's kitchens with coffee and gentle corrections. I thought about Miriam at the quilting frame, starting to say something and then stopping, pressing her hand over mine, saying only, "You are not the first." I thought about all of them, women who had also bled alone, who had also lain in bedrooms unnamed, who had also gripped kitchen counters and smiled at church and been told their pain was a test of faith. Women who had lived their whole lives inside bodies they had never been permitted to understand. Women who had handed the silence forward because it was the only thing they had been given to hand.